I have had students now in my classes coming in freshman year of college who have reported with no regard in one way or another. It's not like they're not proud of it. They're not proud of it. Just they're in a very neutral way. Have said that they've never read a book. Um, and this is this is so foreign to me. This idea that a student can be 18 years old, never read a book.
Tolstoy aficionado, wrestling coach, college professor, also helping with the homeless. That is a lot of elements we typically don't see together. Josh, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Brandon.
So, can you tell me a little bit about how you came to be this weird amalgamation of elements that we typically don't see any one person inhabit?
I think, I mean, the short version is I just always chased after things I was very interested in. My parents gave me a lot of freedom growing up to kind of go after things that I was interested in. During high school as well as college, I would get involved in various student organizations. Once I was done with school, I wasn't tied down anywhere, so I started to travel a lot. And so, yeah, I was able to just kind of go wherever my interests were. And now, after 40 some years, yeah, just a combination of a lot of things I've been interested in at different points in my life. I stay in touch with many of those things. And for me, it's nice to have very divergent interests because when I get really tired of one of them, I can hop over to something that is drastically different to kind of give myself a little bit of a break.
Nice. Yes, I relate to this, and my friend pointed this out to me when I was a freshman in college, and he's like, "Brandon, you are so unusual." And I'm like, "How so?" And he's like, "You're like a redneck and a hipster at the same time." I'm like, "What do you mean by that?" He's like, "You did redneck things before they were cool." So this is when I read your profile and I saw this about you, is something that really touched my heart because I have this idea, and I loosely call it the tragedy of the stereotype, that we have some initial interest in something and then we start affiliating with those people, and before we know it, we become the stereotype, and we take on all the baggage that's associated with that one interest, but then we deny our other interests that might give us that polymath edge that would make us more unique.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing, maybe we get into a little bit of, education or some of my, critiques or, analysis of education. We do start to pigeonhole ourselves a bit earlier in education than maybe we used to. You have 18-year-old students who are asked to sort of choose very specific majors at the age of 18. We used to have a more broad, sort of, if you think about like a liberal arts degree and what that truly meant maybe 100 years ago opposed to now. But yeah, everybody's sort of specializing a lot earlier in life now, and it is yeah, it's discouraging. It's looked down upon for people to try out other things, or during your free time you're supposed to be doing extracurricular activities specific to your career, as opposed to maybe an extracurricular activity that is very different than your career aspirations. Yeah, so when we get like hyper focused on sort of like one narrow path, students might lose out on a lot of other experiences.
Yes, and you as a college professor, you probably have more insight into that because I definitely felt trapped, so to speak, trying to pick a major at 18, and I shifted my sophomore year. And this whole idea that there's this conflation between the liberal arts education framework and career prep that, as I've gotten older, I think is a problem because it's forcing us into these pigeonholes rather than exploring interest and having that more polymathic edge and exploring your curiosities, not necessarily in pursuit of a specific career. And
Uh, at the risk of sounding cliche when we talk about, teaching students kind of how to educate themselves or lifelong learners, yeah, there's something to be said about teaching students how to teach themselves, how to, follow different rabbit holes, if you will, so that yeah, later in life they can explore. different elements of themselves or different interests that they have apart from their career. There's plenty of people, kind of in the online, world social media who talk about how education has changed from a traditional liberal arts education. You're bringing up things like virtue and character towards a more skill-based education where we're just sort of teaching skills. And one of the things that's interesting about that is skills aren't necessarily transferable from one career to the other career. When you go into a new career, you might have to learn new skills for that career over the first few months. But if you're teaching things like, character building or virtue, or what does it mean to sort of live a holistic life, those things, get to follow you throughout whatever your career choices are. Maybe partway through your career, you decide to take a few years off, whether you're a mom or a dad, or you decide to raise your kids for a while, as opposed to, being in the on the career side of life. All of those things in a traditional liberal arts education can give us insight into how to raise children, how to relate with our parents, how to deal with our spiritual side, etc., as opposed to just the skills necessary in order to get a job, and retire well at the age of 65. So, yes, I am a little bit discouraged with the skill set only mindset of education, or what's that become, what education has become, as opposed to tackling a more holistic approach to developing character and virtue, and sort of showing people what it means to live a good life.
Wow, great answer. And I really liked how you roped in the how to be a mom or dad, or how to interact with family members, and character and virtue. And it seems that you want this education to be more holistic and life oriented, not just the career oriented. And that circles back to my point that there's a conflation between the classical liberal arts education framework and now this desire to get onto a career track as fast as possible, so that way you have a jump start and know exactly what you want to do with your life. And we're putting all that pressure on 18 to 22-year olds. And I came across the expression turbulent 20s, and I definitely went through the turbulent 20s and have completely changed my life, especially in the latter part of my 20s and now early 30s. That I look at a lot of the pressure that was put on me to pick a major and do all that as quite silly, because these kids, for lack of a better word, don't know who they are as people.
This fresh in my mind now, just because I'm getting ready for fall semester, is in the fall. I'll be teaching an interpersonal communication course that comes around once every few years. It's one of my favorite courses to teach, specifically for this reason. Is it gets away from a lot of the theoretical aspects with regard to like how relationships work and how they are formed and how they function. And the way that I approach this class is, at the beginning of class, students have to pick a relationship, a tangible relationship, a real relationship in their life. And then their entire semester project is, repairing that relationship, or taking that relationship to a different level, or figuring out a way to make that relationship more fulfilling on their own. So they incorporate these aspects of theory and really sort of put them into practice in their own life. I would hate for a student to leave that class specifically as an expert in understanding how relationships form and how they progress and how they dissolve. Just knowing all the language and the vocabulary. I would hate for them just to leave knowing those sort of steps of relationships and how we're connected, and not have any sort of tangible element with regard to sort of putting it in practice. And so, if you can sort of take some of those theoretical things that we might teach in a more liberal arts or humanities class, and actually, encourage students to try these things out in their own life, then all of a sudden at the end of class you have students who are given reports on, my relationship with my dad is better. Me and my best friend haven't talked since high school because they went to a different college, and now we've sort of formed a different types of relationship. I have to figure out, if I'm in a relationship, I have a girlfriend. Is this really a relationship that's going to work towards a long-term relationship, or is this a relationship that maybe isn't for us, and we have to sort of figure out whether or not we actually belong together? So challenging students to think more closely about the relationships that they have, specifically in that regard. Yeah, like that's a meaningful way to introduce these sort of larger, if you want to say, traditional liberal arts aspects to students, in the 21st century.
That's brilliant because I tend to think there's this compartmentalization for how our education system is set up, that school is over here and this is what school is for, and we read and we take tests and do maybe a science experiment, and then here's life over here on the other side.
Mhm.
So that looks like or that class you talked about seems a very deliberate attempt to break down that invisible wall and make sure that your education is much more directly life applicable, not just in an academic sense, but in a very human connection way.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, I've been teaching for 20 plus years now. It's definitely had, my teaching career has had its ups and downs. But the longer I am in education, the more I try to make sure that this is why I tell my students, you're going to take, I don't know, 40 some classes across across your college career. You're going to take about 40 classes. So you're not going to remember everything from every class, but I always, ask my students, I'm hoping that you are taking something that is useful out of my class. So if there's, a project that happened, or a report that you did, or a book that you read, that's going to stick with you. Those are the things that I'm looking for students to be able to sort of carry out of my class, that has a long-term impact, as opposed to, let's just take a test, regurgitate a bunch of definitions, and then maybe forget them by the time, Christmas break rolls around.
That's excellent. I want to run these definitions by you that I came across in a book I read about the different forms of knowing. The book is called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, written by John Vervaeke and Christopher Mastropietro. Have you heard of this?
No.
Okay, so John Vervaeke is a cognitive scientist or psychologist, and he breaks down the modern meaning crisis and starts all the way back in the caveman days, the Upper Paleolithic era, and he outlines four different types of knowing. And it seems like your pedagogy integrates this, because there's propositional knowing, which is what most people think knowing and intelligence is. It's just knowing statements and facts, and
Yeah.
that is very much in line with the learn something and then write it down and take a test on it. There's procedural knowing, which is more of that skills type of knowing how to do something. So I can't teach you how to ride a bike by just explaining how to ride a bike to you. You need that muscle memory, you need that skill acquisition that's uh, a little bit different than just knowing statements and facts. There's perspectival knowing, which is knowing what it is like. So it's this vantage point that you, when we say have a different perspective, so you know what it's like to be a kid, or you know what it's like to be depressed, and how that influences how you think. And then the last one is participatory knowing, knowing by being. So this is something that you can't learn it until you participate in it. And I think a good example is parenthood, that you can't explain what it's like to be a parent, and you can't learn what it is to be a parent until you are a parent yourself. So in your pedagogy, with this approach of integrating life skills, for lack of a better word, with the theory and the knowing, so that's the propositional marrying with what to me most adequately represents the participatory knowing, that you can't just write this down on a piece of paper, you need to go live this.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, yeah. This is reminding me of an assignment. I'm teaching two summer classes right now. It's the same class, but two different sections. My students just went through. There's a documentary, you can find it online. It's not on YouTube, but it's on somewhere on the internet. Roger Scruton's "Why Beauty Matters" documentary. If people are familiar with that, they should go check it out. But my students had to watch it, and it gives a philosophical understanding of what beauty is, and it tries to make standards for beauty objective, which is really difficult to do. We live in an idea that says, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Roger Scruton pushes back against that idea and says that there are objective standards for beauty, but he says that they are ineffable, so they're impossible to articulate, but he tries to articulate them. But anyways, my students watch this. And then they have to go through an assignment where they talk about, or they break down the ways in which they either see beauty in their own life, or their ways in which they don't see beauty in their life and ways in which they would like to improve, let's say, the environment around them, their dress, their appearance, the artwork that they hang in their bedroom, the way they carry themselves, or take a walk in the woods. So yeah, you can incorporate if some sort of like class on aesthetics. You can talk about aesthetics and the importance of aesthetics, and you can ask your students to sort of start changing their environment, or at least be intentional about their environment. In my public speaking class, which is the summer class I'm teaching right now, so this isn't like a nonverbal section of the class. In a public speaking class, you can talk about nonverbal behaviors, why it's important to maybe dress well, and what sort of message that says about yourself. And you can also require students to, dress in, a shirt and tie when they give their presentations, just to kind of, not to, limit a person's expression, personal expression with regard to their clothing appearances, but it's, put this on and just see if it feels different. See if you try to notice whether or not you are acting different or behaving different, almost as a little self experiment. So even if you think like dressing well is all nonsense and we don't need to wear shirt and ties anymore and it's not a big deal, it's one of those things where it's like, humor me as the professor, put on a shirt and tie when you give a presentation, and while you're giving the presentation, reflect on whether or not you feel like you are carrying yourself better, if you feel like you're more professional, if you notice the ways in which people are treating you differently or not. Just it's one of those things. Like, you have to start running a lot of experiments that you immediately reflect on once you start changing your behaviors in life. Once you start grasping certain educational concepts, immediately sort of like put those out in the universe, try them out in the world, and then reflect on whether or not they actually made a difference. So there's an intentionality with regard to, let's learn a concept, let's play around with the concept, let's be a little experimental with the concept, and then see if it yields some sort of results or a change in the behavior or the environment that we're in. And so getting students away from just, here's a concept, write it down on the paper, do you understand the concept? It's write it down on the paper, throw it out there, play around with it for the next few days, kind of in your day-to-day interactions, and then reflect on whether or not it's a concept sort of worth holding on to. And if you do this enough, you really can start to, for a lack of a better term, change your life. You can, if you change your behavior, all of a sudden the people who are interacting with you start to treat you differently, start to see you differently. So yeah, you gotta change your behavior a little bit. You gotta change the ways in which you approach the world if you want to start, if you want the world to start, reflecting those things back upon you. And so yeah, I think students need to be a little bit more engaged with practicing the things that they're learning in the classroom.
Yes, that's a wonderful answer. I was thinking of this line that changed my life. I got it from Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he wrote, all of life is an experiment. The more experiments you make, the better.
Hmm.
And you use that word explicitly, experiment, like go out and try these things. And I come from a STEM background, so experiment has a heavier connotation to me, that you have a control condition and a test condition, that you are going to try something, you are going to collect the data, you're going to analyze it, you're going to interpret the results and draw your conclusions. And that has been a really helpful mindset to have, that adds a little bit more sophistication to the adage cliche, try new things. That no, don't just try new things, be very conscious about what you're doing and that data you're collecting. What you said about wearing a shirt and tie, and see, do people treat you differently? Do you have micro adjustments in your behavior because you want to be becoming of a person that wears suits and ties? So that
Yep.
was very interesting. And this is all coalescing together about, how do you approach teaching knowledge, which is this propositional knowing, versus the life skills and wisdom, which you've already elaborated on. And I want you to share a little bit of that anecdote with the student in one of your classes.
The which
Uh,
antidote?
Katrina.
Oh, with oh yes, yeah. Um, so with regard to I'll go ahead and tell the story here for the audience. I was not sure that I wanted to be a college professor as I was going through grad school, which is sort of the training grounds for people who want to be college professors. I went to grad school because I've always been good at school. People told me I was good at school, and people started to say, we can get you assistantships if you want to continue to go to school. So I continued to go to school. I had no plans. And then in 2008, I was done with my master's degree. The job market completely collapsed. Nobody was hiring. So I started to adjunct teaching part time. And as I was teaching part time, one of the places I was teaching part time said, you might be you should apply for a PhD with us. We think you would be great in the program. I applied. I got into the program. And then I was about 2 years in to this PhD program, and I was teaching a class. Um, it was an intercultural class, and in this class, I meet Katrina. So up until this point, I didn't really have an interest in teaching long term, being a college professor. Um, in this class, I have my classes. They always have a very strict attendance policy and late work policy. I'm like, you get a couple of absences, and then you start getting points taken off. I don't accept late work. If you miss the class, you just get a zero. So we go through the first week of class, Monday, Wednesday, Friday class. And the first week of class, this person, Katrina, is on my roster. She does not show up. She shows up the following Monday. The following Monday, she shows up about 5, 10 minutes late to class. Very unapologetic, walks across the front of the classroom while I'm teaching, 5 to 10 minutes in the class, sits to my left in the front row, sits down, jacket on, backpack on, just sits down, doesn't pull out paper or pen, no note taken. And just kind of sits there for the next 40 minutes of teaching a 50-minute class. When the class is over, she comes up and just very casually says, I wasn't here. What do I miss? No, she's not apologetic for missing the class or anything. And I tell her, I say, here's the syllabus, read over the syllabus. The assignments are on the syllabus. And I just want to let you know you missed all of last week. So you have used up all your absences. You don't get any more absences without penalty. And you missed a quiz last Friday. So you're going to get a zero on that quiz that we had last Friday because you missed it. And she is irate. So it's just me and her in the classroom. Everyone else is left. How dare you? I wasn't here. You shouldn't be penalizing students who aren't here. The first week is just a syllabus week. It doesn't count. All my other professors allow me to do X, Y, and Z. And I'm just very firm with her. I'm like, this is my policy. You missed the quiz on Friday, you get a zero. You used up all your absences. Don't miss any more classes. You're going to lose points. And she storms out. She continues to come to class, but she's always like sitting in the front row in the corner, not very involved in class, just kind of huffing and puffing the entire semester. She's doing okay, like a C student. She does all right on her assignments and everything, but she's just not involved and is very, upset, we'll say, with the strictness. So I don't do tardy work, or I don't do allow students late to class. So I don't let them be tardy, and I don't accept late work. So the class starts when it starts. Assignments are due when they're due. I'm pretty straightforward on all these things. Finally, get to the end of the semester, and Katrina has to give a big project and an analysis of some sort of like intercultural issue. And she does an analysis based on Chris Rock had a movie that came out at that time, a documentary called Good Hair. And we're talking about like intercultural issues. So Good Hair is about sort of the hair industry in America, specifically for black women. And there's this huge section in the film that talks about most of that hair comes from India. So Chris Rock has this huge section, like what is this sort of like interesting sort of intercultural relationship of culture and economics and everything else with regard to these hair is being cut at in Indian temples, specifically as part of a religious ceremony, and then some of that hair is being bought and sold in America to African American women. So Chris Rock has this discussion in the middle of the film on this issue. And Katrina does a fantastic job sort of analyzing all this and then sort of like looking at the larger concept of, America's hair industry in these regards, the economics of it, the cultural significance of it. She does a great job on, like, I've never seen her more excited and elated in class, and she's very engaged. She looks like a whole different person during her presentation. After her presentation, she shows up to my office hours. I say, like, this was a great job, fantastic. And she says, yeah, it's like, I really, like this class. Thank you so much. And I, feel like I really did a good job, and I got really excited about this final project, etc. Pretty short conversation where I just said, you did a great job. And she says, thank you very much. A couple days later, after the class is over, I submit the final grades. She sends me this really long email that I printed off and I keep in a little box of emails I've gotten over the years from students. And it was just this long email that said, thank you for the semester. I know that I was a pain in the rear end at the beginning of the semester and I gave you a bunch of attitude. But essentially, you, the professor, didn't, take my bull crap. Like, you had very firm standards, and that's what she needed. She just says, like, thank you for, like, nobody's ever really like stood up to me. Nobody's told me that like I can sort of do interesting academic work, that I'm intelligent enough to get through a class without having a bunch of attitude. She always felt like the only way she would sort of get ahead in life is if she just threw an attitude or had an argument with somebody, as opposed to, like, I can just be a competent person, right? And I can sort of like get the results I want by just being competent, by doing the work and sitting down. And she said, like, you're the first person who ever sort of challenged me in this way. And because of that, I feel like I flourished academically and I sort of reached a different level on my academics. And then she gets to the end of the letter and says, thank you for this. And she's going to graduate college in a couple years. And then she says, like, one day, when I'm president, I'll thank you in the inauguration speech, which I thought was fun. But that was the moment when I realized you can really make a difference with a student. And that's what I was like, I want to be a college professor now. I think I want to be a teacher. To see a student go from, like, week one, just not involved, total attitude, just wants to, like, float by, like, give me a C and get me out of here, to I'm actually interested in the academic discussion going on. I can do really good work. I can be a completely different person who is curious and have interesting conversations. Just to see that happen in, like, a short 16 weeks, I was like, wow, like, this, education can really do good things for people. And I was like, I think I want to be a professor now.
Wow, what an incredible story, especially seeing it happen live in one semester. I bet that was the cherry on top, that it wasn't protracted across years. It was you, you saw all of that transpire in the 16-week course, and she nailed her final assignment after
Yeah.
getting a 0 on her first one. That's those are the stories that dreams are made out of right there.
Yeah. And, I don't know if I've had another student who's made that kind of impression on me with regard to their arc in just one semester. But I've definitely seen a lot of students make that kind of progress, let's say freshman year to senior year. I've had plenty of students come in freshman year, very shy, don't speak up in class, and then I see them their senior year. Maybe they take a class with me as a senior. They're out of their shell. They're involved with extracurricular activities. They have internships. They have friends. They might have girlfriends or boyfriends. They're more outgoing. And yeah, that's the stuff that excites me about teaching, is realizing you have a student in front of you who's really struggling, but with my teaching experience and the years that I've seen many students throughout my years, you realize, like, that the student doesn't have to necessarily, like, stay in that one spot. So you see a student, you're like, oh, this is going to be a really this is a difficult student. They're having trouble in class. They're not outgoing. Like, they need to sort of, like, they need to figure things out. But you just, I keep reminding myself, like, I've seen students like this before, and I have seen them make huge progress in a year, or maybe it takes 4 years. But people can change when they are challenged, when they are given certain reading materials, or they take certain classes. They're asked to do certain assignments. Yeah, I mean, you know, experiences in the classroom, or experiences with education, wherever you might find education for yourself, whether it's in a classroom or in some sort of, like, YouTube online classroom. Um, yeah, like, experiences with education can change people, and so that's why I keep sort of, chugging along as best as I can, year after year, hoping that I make a little bit of a difference for some of these students.
Yes, and it's really nice to hear this firsthand, because that seems to be a running theme with educators, professors all the way down to pre-K, that they enjoy seeing the cultivation of character and wisdom and growth, not just the imparting of factual domain specific
Hmm.
knowledge. So that's another, that segues into another point I want to ask you, because with Katrina, for lack of a better expression, you gave her tough love. You said these are the standards and I'm not budging, and that's exactly what she needed. Do you think that we are tending to infantilize students, especially in the college years now, and that it's causing part of the education and literacy crisis?
Yeah, I think the literacy crisis is starting, far beyond or like way before college starts. But no, I mean, I think the infantilization of students is a huge problem that's going on for a long time. And there's something, I don't know, it's multifaceted. I'm not a person who, gets onto, social media and it's like, this is the problem and here's how you solve it. There's a lot of layers to this stuff that I'm sure goes
Wait,
back,
wait. Do you mean to say that you can't summarize a complicated problem with a tweet
no,
and that it
that is, yes,
requires
that is what
nuance
I'm
and
saying.
debate?
Yeah,
That's that's
there's
a
some
hot
nuance.
take in 2026.
I know, I know. This is why I'm so bad at social media. 'Cause I'm
Oh,
probably,
likewise.
I'm not too much of a hardliner on these things. Um, I think something happened where educators made a decision collectively somehow um, that they never want students to be uncomfortable. Where if a student has has a complaint, no matter how small it is, educators started to, you know, they rush to sort of fix the problem for the student. We call these things accommodations, um, as opposed to telling the student, no, like these are the rules and the standards, and this is what has to be followed. Even with things like, I don't know, you think of like plagiarism. It wasn't that long ago. You got caught plagiarizing a paper, it's an automatic zero. Sometimes it's a zero in the class, like you just completely fail the class. You plagiarize one paper in the class, you fail the class. Now there's a whole, tribunal involved, and maybe we won't fail you on this, or we'll let you redo the assignment, which is ridiculous. You plagiarize a paper, I'm going to let you redo the assignment, or you'll accept it for half credit if you redo the assignment. Little things in that direction. You tell a student to, let's say, dress up for, when they have to give a presentation or a speech. And their idea of dressing up isn't as dressed up as maybe they need to be. And professors just kind of let it slide, as opposed to telling a student, no, like you need to go home and, change your clothes and maybe you can give the presentation next class. Um, so, yeah, I think something is going on with professors or maybe teachers in general just not being as strict, for a lack of a better term, when it comes to some of this stuff. Tardiness, late work, etc. A lot of schools have kind of done away with enforcing those policies as strict as I think they ought to be enforced, allowing students to come in a little bit late, and the student says, "Well, my ride was late, or I got stuck in traffic, or this, that, or whatever." You start to let that slide in one instance, and all of a sudden, your entire class is going to be 5, 10 minutes late the next class period, and the same is true with late work. It's not that things pop up that are there's plenty of things that pop up that are out of your control. Um, but when you start accepting every little excuse, all of a sudden, students are going to find an excuse. Who knew? I would find an excuse, of course, right? I'm a human being. I'm not saying that I'm always punctual or always get my work in on time. But yeah, I mean, allowing standards to slide uh, does something to the educational experience, and I don't think it's good. Um, because I do think that education should be about challenging students to kind of get to the next level, whatever that level is for them. And if you just sort of tell a student, like, you're allowed to come in as a freshman and just kind of do exactly what it is you want to do and live exactly how you want to live for all 4 years, they're not going to grow from that. But you tell a student like, hey, you're 18 and you're not where you need to be yet. I'm going to challenge you a little bit. Um, you need to cultivate some character or virtue or study habits or what have you. Uh, you have to make things a little bit hard so that a student can progress. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I think that's relevant to my experience too, because I definitely profited from the infantilization culture and then it caught up to me later to my detriment. And I call it like this isn't an official paradigm, it's just my way of articulating it of the factoid knowing versus the emotional learning. And when you challenge somebody, the to me the goal is to make them fail. That if they're not failing, then that's not a proper challenge because we need that emotional learning associated with the failure. We need that gut sinking feeling of, oh, I didn't make it. So that forces the retrospective of, let me go back and see where things started going wrong. And that squarely fits into the life skills and wisdom part of education that, as you pointed out, it seems that the universities aren't so keen on allowing like you have to kind of induce it. I guess it can come across a bit unsavory or sadistic, but I do think we need to induce this emotional distress associated with failure to some degree so that you have that operant conditioning of like, oh, this is what this feels like. I'll do better
Yeah.
next time.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's that emotional component. I definitely agree with you there. I also think it's important that people in general, whatever your chosen, path is in life, I think it's important to fail just so that you realize that you're not at the top of your game yet. So if you go in and you just kind of get A's with, let's say, just kind of habits that aren't necessarily, maybe poorer habits than you could possibly have. Um, but you're allowed to kind of skirt by and still get A's. That's not you need to fail every once in a while to kind of get you that next level of what it means to study a little bit harder or work a little bit harder or clean up your writing or whatever. If I make a quick analogy to some of the stuff I do like outside of academic with sports, yeah, it's like every once in a while I'll take one of my really good like wrestlers in the room and it's like I'm gonna find an opponent for you who's gonna beat you up pretty bad. uh, who's gonna it's gonna happen. And it's not, is it nice to be, let's say a wrestler and be undefeated your entire season, go 25-0, but then you go to the postseason, you get beat up by a bunch of, other kids who are in the postseason in the playoffs. Um, that's not good for an athlete. An athlete needs to, they talk about this in professional sports too. Like it's good for teams to get beat kind of early in the season a little bit because they need to kind of they need to deflate their egos a bit and realize like we're not as good as we think we are. Like we need a tougher opponent early in the season, and that gives us information with regard to how hard we need to train so that when it comes to the postseason, now we are able to go into the postseason. And if it's wrestling, you can win a couple matches, or if it's football, you can win a couple playoff games. But if your entire season is like just kind of coasting to an undefeated record, as soon as you get to some real competition, like that's going to be a problem. So yeah, it's important emotionally for people to fail sometimes and then kind of be okay with it and figure out how to fail gracefully. But it's also important for people to be put in positions to fail and to fail pretty hard, just so that they are reminded that they are kind of not as developed as they would like to be. If you want to be a better writer, you don't want to go into an English class where you're just getting an A on all your papers. You want to go in an English class with, an old school marm who's gonna, take out her red pen and, give you a C on a paper, and you have to kind of just sit with that for a while and realize, like, yeah, maybe I could have written this better. I could have, made better edits. My grammar, my sentences weren't as clear as they should have been. Yeah, but we need to be in positions where we fail, just as a reminder that we can, go farther, work harder, become more intelligent in our, chosen major.
Agreed. It's the titular small pond syndrome. And
Yeah.
I've iteratively progressed into larger ponds throughout my life. That and once I got through the rough ones, once I had that experience for the first and second time, I then actively seek out the larger ponds because I
Mm-hmm.
realize how inadequate I still am, and then that's what stimulates growth. So it, not to make it sound like sadistic or masochistic or anything like that, but it is a good, worthwhile experience to constantly seek out those larger and larger ponds. And I did it first. I left my hometown by an hour. Right when I went to uni, went to University of Central Florida, just an hour drive. But then I went to Washington D.C. area for grad school. And now I did the expat thing. So I'm progressively trying to challenge myself because I realized how much I skated by on that infantilization structure. Now, I want to shift the style of this infantilization to broaching academic topics because in one of your interviews I listened to, you say it's important to not sugarcoat topics. And that seems to be something that is pervasive in academia at times, that think critically, but not like that. And have you had any experience with this?
Uh, I think some of the stuff some of the stuff you might read online or in the comment section in social media, I think some of it's a little bit exaggerated when it comes to higher ed. It's a really good professor at at UPenn, University of Pennsylvania, just up the road from me. His name's Jonathan Zimmerman. And I've met him a few times, had lunch with him. He has a couple books he's written. And some of the stuff that he reminds us of, that he reminds me of, is that most higher ed institutions are pretty small and local. A lot of the sort of, the large, let's say the large protest types of campuses where students are asking for trigger warnings and, sugarcoat things and make everything safe for them. That's actually sort of like the minority of campuses, like numerically. It's pretty small because most people do go to sort of smaller local campuses with a few thousand students. You go to your classes, you go home, you go to your classes, you go to work. Most students in college don't have time. They're not on campus all day, so they don't go to class and then go to a protest, or they don't go to class and then go get involved in campus politics. They go home. They live lives outside of academia. Um, and the way I've taught since I started teaching back in grad school, and I was 23 when I had my first class. When I was teaching my first class, uh, I never sugarcoated anything, so to speak. Uh, I think it's mostly because I was just like I was from a working class background. My parents did construction. Um, Academia was like this like weird, interesting thing to me that like other people did. So I didn't really have any experience in it. I just kind of went into the classroom and I kind of carried the culture and the attitude and the language and the communication skills I had from this working class background of say what you mean what you say. Let's be very direct. I don't have time for it's not that I don't have time to be polite, but it's like I'm not going to go out of my way uh, yeah, I guess sugarcoat a topic. If we're going to talk about a topic, like here's the definition of the topic. I'm going to be very straightforward on it. I'm not going to go out of my way to be mean or nasty to people, but I'm not going to go out of my way to put in a bunch of, let's say, put in a bunch of qualifiers or trigger warnings or like let's have a 10-minute conversation about how this might be difficult before we get into the topic. I'm just gonna like this is the topic for the day. You saw it on the syllabus. You know what the topic is. We're gonna start talking about it, and I'm very straightforward and analytical about it. I've never thought much. Maybe that's not a good thing, but I haven't thought much about the emotional weight that some of these topics might bring into the classroom. I'm not unaware that some of the topics in the classroom can be difficult, but I've never bought into the idea that there are some topics that are so emotionally weighted that students are going to fall apart and then cry as soon as they leave my classroom. Any experience I've ever had with I don't know, probably a few thousand students at this point. Um, yeah, I mean the students they're fine. They weigh in on the topics. Some of them are hard topics, but yeah, they get through it. They add to the discussion. Some of them push back on my ideas, which are great. I have plenty of students who have challenged me very, directly over the years, and I enjoy those, and we can talk about why I enjoy those if you want. Um, yeah, but if it's a real topic happening, in the news, for instance, it's like they're, students need to understand how to sort of argue through that idea, and I'll help them make their arguments, but I'm not gonna sit there and say, we're gonna completely avoid this.
Excellent. I like your point that the worst offenders, so to speak, that's kind of blown out of proportion. That's on a small minority of campuses, very very small, and it's also social media. I think that
Yeah.
the people who do have those behaviors tend to be more active on social media and know how to leverage social media more. I'm biased, and actually, I've had two wildly different experiences now because I was in Arlington, Virginia, Washington D.C. area, which a lot of that culture did permeate more socially, not necessarily at the uni that I was at. And then I'm over in Europe now a lot in Portugal, hanging out in expat communities, hanging out with Eastern Europeans, and they have thick skin. They'll say whatever, and they laugh at Americans at how soft we are. So I've seen
Mm.
both ends of this, and it's very interesting. And I consider knowledge and critical thinking and open debate, the First Amendment, as sacred. To me, that is the path forward to enlightenment. And I understand that people get their emotions wrapped up in these topics, especially if they're more directly relevant to anybody's given lives. I'm guilty of that too. But I have more of the Sam Harris mindset that if we actually want to make things better, if we want to improve, we must approach these dispassionately. And perhaps it's because I come from a psychology background where I'm much more keen on self deception and bias, cognitive biases and such, that I want that analytic, plainly stated, let's try to check our emotions at the door as much as we can to resolve these very difficult issues that are of high consequence.
Yeah, s- one of my, if I had a critique, maybe like a top five list, one of the top five critiques I might have, I've sort of mentioned in other places, I, I'm concerned about the student life creep kind of into the classroom. So we do have, most universities very, you have very robust, student life, residence life, where students do have these programs around, emotional well-being and safety and everything else. Uh, my concern is when those programs that are on the student life side, in your dorm room, they'll start to come into the classroom, and all of a sudden, my classroom or other professors' classrooms are then subjected to some sort of rules that might be more appropriate for residence life. So if you come into freshman orientation and residence life is the one who is in charge of student orientation, and they're talking about, we're a family here and let's all be inclusive and like, let's talk about inclusive language and trigger warnings and safety and everything else. That the boundaries that residence life sets up, I think it are totally appropriate for your house, like for your dorm room. Like in your dorm room, like put on whatever movie makes you feel good. Like have all the emotions you need to have. Like if somebody is in that room making you feeling uncomfortable by, their political beliefs or like who they voted for, like fine, you kick them out. Like I'm not going to invite people into my house if they're going to sit there and have arguments over cultural issues. Like I don't want to, like that's my house. Like in my house, I want it to be a very soft, cuddly place, right? But in the classroom, like I don't need those boundaries of what is appropriate for residence life. Put on your pajama pants and a warm robe. Like I don't need that sort of those ideas in the classroom. In the classroom, it's like no, like now we're gonna dress professional, be as you said, like be dispassionate. We're gonna be confronted with things that are difficult, and for an hour in my classroom, that might exist. Once we leave my classroom, you can run back to your house or your dorm or whatever and have whatever sort of emotions that are totally appropriate. Like if you have an emotional reaction to a topic, that's fine and that's acceptable. But this sort of like we need to get back to sort of compartmentalizing where these emotional spaces are. And it's fine in your personal bedroom, in your dorm room, like having that's an emotional space. And when residence life starts to creep into my syllabus, or they start to critique my reading list, or they want to go over some sort of approval process with regard to what I'm assigning students and how that might emotionally affect them, that's when I start to have a problem. Um, so we just need to compartmentalize. Like, this is a residence life side of campus, this is an academic side of campus, and there needs to be a nice firm wall between those two when it comes to students' expectations for, we'll call, broadly call it emotional safety, I guess.
Excellent response. I really like that line you drew of how the student life is permeating into the academics. And that's definitely problematic, in my opinion, too. I want to move on now because we hinted at it, talking about the infantilization of the students. And then I also keyed in on the literacy crisis. And you said that you think that starts long before, which, yes, I agree too. So I want you to talk a little bit about the literacy crisis. What do you think is causing it? How bad do you think it is? And also maybe dovetail into the question of, do you think we're going through a cultural recession and that the literacy crisis might be a core of that?
Yeah, so we'll start here. In my freshman classes, most of my freshman classes, I'll start with a broad discussion for the first week on like what are the humanities, and we'll talk about the Western canon, and we'll just kind of get some of those, those like $50 words that kind of get thrown around in academia. It's like we're gonna just kind of talk about what this is for the first week because you're gonna hear these things a lot over the next 4 years. So we just need to kind of understand like what are the humanities or liberal arts education, what's the Western canon. We need to know what that means, broadly speaking. Um, and when I do this, I do ask my students in a participatory manner to talk about some of the books that they've read over, throughout high school or maybe over the summer, or books they read, and we sort of talk about whether or not they are canonical, what makes a book canonical as opposed to not canonical, for instance. So I just kind of get a good read, no pun intended, on what my students, are reading. In the last few years, astonishingly enough, I have had students now in my classes coming in freshman year of college, who have reported with no regard in one way or another. It's not like they're not proud of it. They're not proud of it. Just they're in a very neutral way. Have said that they've never read a book, um, and this is this is so foreign to me. This idea that a student can be 18 years old, never read a book. And one thing that I have found with these students, and then this kind of dovetails into some of the stuff I do with coaching at the junior high and the high school level, because I'll talk to my kids that I coach about some of the stuff they're doing in school. I've talked to junior high and high school kids that I coach about what they're doing in school, and some of them have talked about how they aren't assigned books; they're assigned reading packets. Not all, but some. They're assigned reading packets, and some of those reading packets they're just like they're short stories or they're excerpts of a book, um, uh, and so they're not reading necessarily. Some of the students, not all, but it is becoming a trend where more and more students at the junior high and high school level aren't being assigned entire books to read cover to cover. And so the teachers might just pick out like really important concepts or ideas or like metaphors within a book. I had a college student a few years ago talk about how they had read The Great Gatsby in high school, but the professor or the teacher in the high school like assigned like a chunk of pages, skip, 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 a chunk of pages, skip, 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 chunk of pages, right? Because they were only focusing for the entire book. They were only focusing on the metaphor of the green light. Like that's the only thing they talked about with The Great Gatsby. The Great Gatsby's like 100 pages.
It's a short
You just
book.
read the whole
Yeah.
book, but like they skipped around in the book because the teacher's like, we're going to read this for like a week, but we're only going to focus on the metaphor of the green light. And if you want to go back and read it yourself later, you're welcome to. But we're just going to kind of read these few pages. And then the teacher just kind of gets in front of the class and kind of gives the rest of the information the students maybe would have got if they would have read the entire book, but they're not assigned the entire book. So they're not, they're high school, so they're not going to read a book they're not assigned. And so I do think there's something about what we are requiring students, how many books we're requiring. It's an education thing. It could easily be solved. I've posted this multiple times on X. You know, I think a great schedule, at least like maybe kindergarten through sixth grade. Um, you know, school should kind of like instruction for school should end by lunchtime. Like get to school in the morning, do all your direct instruction, and then the afternoon should just be like research and or recess and reading. Like just kind of open play and quiet time reading a book for like 3 hours or so before your parents pick you up. Um, and yeah, I'm wondering about there's it's not that there's plenty of like interesting like two parent household income kind of thing. It's like kids need to be in school. Like maybe part of it's a babysitting service. So kids need to be in school 6 to 8 hours a day. But it doesn't mean they have to have direct instruction like nobody can handle direct instruction for 8 hours a day. Uh, so it's why aren't we just sort of putting kids on couches and beanbag chairs and say, let's, just kind of quietly read a book. And once you get tired with a book for 20 minutes, you can go play with Legos or blocks, or maybe go outside and play kickball. Like just some sort of wind down of the school day, that is a little bit more, quiet reading time. I think we could make that possible in our sort of K through 12 education system. As far as the sort of cultural literacy or the cultural decline, one thing that I get really adamant about, you could say, is there's a literacy crisis, if you will. Everybody's seen all these statistics online. There's lots of ways to interpret this crisis and what it means. One of my concerns that I think might be different from other people's concerns, outside the cliche concerns, is that when people are not reading, it also means that they're not reading the same books. Obviously, if nobody's reading, they're not reading the same books. Stories and books hold a culture together. And so if we aren't all reading similar stories and books, there's this question like what do we have in common? What's holding us together? What are these like they're referred to sometimes as like myths and fantasy themes. Like what is like we have these stories of like 1776 and the founding fathers, and we have a fantasy theme. You think of like MLK's like I have a dream speech. Like where do we want to go? We have to have some sort of shared stories with each other, narratives, and usually in the education, like historically in our education system, this was found in books. So you would go through school, and by the time you graduated high school, it's like everybody across the country like read Huckleberry Finn, right? Everybody across the country had read the Declaration of the Constitution. Everybody across the country had read, a Charles Dickens novel or a novel or a Jane Austen novel, or had read some Shakespeare, right? So the entire graduating class of, seniors in high school across the country all had a basic curriculum literacy with regard to the stories that they had consumed, and having a shared understanding of stories holds people. It creates That's what creates culture. It holds people together. I mean, sports does this to an extent. We know that it does it with we know that it happens with sports. If you're I live near Philadelphia, so it's like you're an Eagles fan and I'm an Eagles fan. It's like we have that in common. We sort of feel a bond with each other, right? And the same is true with sort of like what we've been educated with. If you have an entire country that has read, the same, let's say, 50 books throughout high school, it's like that's gonna hold you together somehow. People talk a lot about like religion. Like religion does this. People feel bonded to other people when it comes to like sharing a religion, or at least understanding biblical stories. So when we talk about the effects on culture, I think that the declining literacy, it creates it creates I don't know, like friction perhaps, or complete it completely breaks culture apart, because people no longer have it's one less thing that people have in common. So if we do all have, if we all are football fans, football is going to hold us together. That's one thing but it's like shared stories of the books we read, Mark Twain, Huckleberry Finn, To Kill a Mockingbird. You think about all those books you read in school, right? Like those were things that held people together. And if we all stop reading books, it's like that's one less variable that we have in this very short list of variables that held us together. If everybody went to church on Sunday, and it's not, some people go to church, some people go to temple, some people go to mosque, some people like it starts to sort of create these yeah, it starts to break culture apart as variables we no longer have in common. So that's one of the concerns I have about the decline in literacy, amongst many other things.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that was an excellent example, and you're definitely showing your expertise in rhetoric with the idea of shared stories. And I had heard the notion of the Western canon, and I knew there were the classics and such. I didn't realize that it was as codified as it actually is. And I come from a religious upbringing too, evangelical, Southern Baptist Christian type. So I can definitely relate to this shared stories. And I think with literature, especially the Western canon, and tracing the Odyssey is relevant, right? So tracing things all the way back to the Odyssey or the Epic of Gilgamesh, even that's their cultural fabric. That's the story of that's the telling the story of the stories and how they evolved through time. And that is what teaches us, or that's what gives us our collective ethos, our collective doctrine, our collective value structure. And if people aren't reading those, as you say, then we don't have this shared sense of wisdom of this is what makes a wise life. Like I read Count of Monte Cristo for the first time recently, and seeing one is it's not necessarily like a cold-blooded revenge tale. I had always had that notion that it was cold-blooded revenge, where it's like, no, this guy thought he was ordained by God to go do this, and it's an indictment on aristocracy, so it had classism in it too. I'm like, that's where some of these notions come from. And in the age of social media, so we have the literacy decline, plus the age of social media, and also unrestricted access. This keys on your other point that we're not reading the same book. Even if we are we reading the same books? Because it used to be, what does your local library have? Now it's, what does Amazon Kindle supply, or can you find elsewhere? So I thought that was something I hadn't ever thought of before. So that's a really interesting point that I want to rope back into one in a moment. And my closing point is, I think reading isn't just learning the stories and having the shared commonalities and wisdom structures. I look at reading as cognitive training, is it helps train your focus and attention. So that's where I lean toward. It doesn't matter what you're reading, just read something, because from my point of view, as long as you're not scrolling on 6-second long digestible content and you're reading something that requires attention in at least 20 or 30-minute chunks, it's like running, you're giving your brain a workout. So that's something else I think is important about reading.
Mm.
What do you think about striking a balance between telling students what to read versus self-initiated learning? So I just brought up the Count of Monte Cristo, for example, and I distinctly remember that my class was assigned Pride and Prejudice while my best friend's class was assigned Count of Monte Cristo. And I hated that. And I hated every word of Pride and Prejudice. I was a 16-year-old boy. I didn't want to hear about love and feelings and marrying your cousin. I wanted a swashbuckling tale of adventure. And I think it kind of ruined my English class a little bit for me. So it's important for us to read books and have that shared understanding, but I also think it's important to allow people to indulge their curiosity and let them choose what they want to read. So do you have any thoughts on how that can rope into education?
Well, I mean, when it comes to education, I do think there are, core books. I think people just need to realize that for every book you might take out of the curriculum that you think is important, or for every book you want to put in the curriculum, you're gonna have to take out a classic. So if you do think that Jane Austen is an important author to know, yeah, at some point you're gonna have to sort of quote unquote force a 16-year-old to read Pride and Prejudice. Um, but I do think it's interesting that let's say reading specifically English. There's something we do when we get a little bit more. We have these conversations that are a little bit more choose your own adventure when it comes to students that we don't have in math class, right? For math class or for science class, it's like you're gonna learn addition today. And like, I don't want to learn addition. It's like you got to learn addition. You're gonna learn the periodic table of elements. Well, I'd want to do something else. It's like you're gonna learn this, but yeah, these discussions on English class, it's like you're going to learn Jane Austen today. And it's like, why? I want to learn something. It's like, because you have to. So I do think that there is something about, yes, you're going to have to do some things you don't want to do. And if one of the things that teachers and professors have to do a better job of is explaining to students why particular authors or books are important. So if you get into why Jane Austen is historically important and this is why you have to read her, it doesn't become an exercise in I have to enjoy this book particularly. It's that I need to read this book because it's part of, we can use the term broadly, cultural inheritance. This is my cultural inheritance and I need to know about it. So I might, be a young kid who would prefer to read Harry Potter. But if a teacher says like you can read Harry Potter on your own time, that's a leisurely fun activity, and maybe you should be reading Harry Potter on your own time for leisure. But in an English class where we're reading, we're not just reading to consume the words on the page, but we need to be teaching certain books sort of in a longer tradition of, I'm going to say the term again, cultural inheritance. So these are the important authors that we can sort of trace back canonically. Here's how they relate to each other. So it's more than just about reading a story because it's a important story, or it's more about just like reading a story because like it's a story that we feel like we have to teach, but because it's an important story in the timeline of English literature, in that regard. As far as you know some of these stories and books, I've mentioned this, in a few other places. I don't think I don't think it's necessary to have students maybe read the longest or the most difficult things of authors. But I do think it's important to introduce students to these, we'll call them canonical authors. So The Old Man and the Sea is one of the books that I'll assign for one of my classes. And The Old Man and the Sea is a very short book, but it's by Ernest Hemingway. And my hope is that students will read The Old Man and the Sea, and then they'll say, now I'm going to go read, so it's a 80-page novella. And then they get interested in Hemingway, and now they're going to go read, A Farewell to Arms. My students do not read, the like The Idiot or The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, which are thousands of pages total. But they do read Notes from Underground, which is like 100 pages. And my hope is like Dostoevsky is an important person. Let's look at a couple of his ideas in Notes from Underground, and now you can kind of go read. Maybe you get interested in Crime and Punishment as your next read. Same with Tolstoy. Tolstoy is one of my favorites, probably my favorite. But I don't assign War and Peace. They're not going to read War and Peace. They're not going to read 1,400 pages in my class. They're going to read The Death of Ivan Ilyich, right? They're going to read a 100-page short story that has a lot of Tolstoy ideas embedded in the story, and now I can hopefully kind of kickstart you to appreciate and like this author, and then maybe in your free time later you're going to go read, well, let's say Anna Karenina, which happens to be my favorite Tolstoy. So I think there's ways in which you can introduce authors that are canonical. Maybe you don't have to read the most difficult books or the longest books by those authors, but you just kind of get students familiar with the important authors. And then hopefully after they leave your class, they might kind of sit down and tackle something a little bit, more challenging or a little bit longer.
Excellent. It's funny that you mentioned the Dostoevsky books because I read Crime and Punishment and Brothers Karamazov, and I often say those were the hardest books I've ever read. And I come from a very different background too. I come from STEM, so I didn't spend a whole lot of time reading the classics beyond high school. And I'm currently going through Notes from the Underground.
Mm.
And the point I want to make with these two is I think my education didn't do a good job at explaining that literature, and this is my current opinion, which you might disagree with, that good literature to me is philosophy and a narrative. That
Okay.
it's the debating of some idea. Now, I definitely go out looking for the more philosophically inclined works, given I'm reading Dostoevsky a lot of the time. But a lot of literature, that's just what it is to me. That here's an idea that this person wants to promote or promulgate or debate, and then see how that fits into the history and the timeline of whatever tradition they come from. And
Mhm.
I don't know if I was just zoning out and being an idiot teenager, but that wasn't something that really clicked for me until my mid 20s when I had that classic, oh, you don't understand the books now, but you'll come back to them later. So I fell into that stereotype very neatly. And I remember having this grand revelation of I'm like, I never read 1984 because it was not appropriate for high schoolers. Like that was a book that they
Yeah.
explicitly didn't teach. We did Animal Farm instead. So I'm like, I never read 1984. And then I realized 2 + 2 = 5 and Thought Police, and there was two or three others. I'm like, holy smokes, these are all from the same book. I thought Thought
Yeah.
Police was just common jargon. I didn't realize
Yeah.
it came from that book. So the idea of obviously 1984 is heavily politically philosophical, and then that it permeated our lexicon, that I am saying things from that book and don't even realize what I am saying.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I tell my students with regard to, just the study of the humanities in general is like, I mean, yeah, you learn where your culture came from. Like, culture didn't start the day you were born. That's one of the things I say to my students the first day of class. And you have to kind of understand where the cult, like where, like the world you currently sit in, like how was it built? Like where did it come from? And you can even, I mean, you can even go through like pop culture movies and music with students, and then you can kind of trace that back and say like these aren't original ideas. Like these are stories that have been told multiple times in different ways throughout centuries. But these ideas are not necessarily new. Like you think it's new because it's like your new favorite pop song or your new favorite movie that just came out. But these are sort of borrowed ideas that kind of go back into the past a very long way. And so that's part of what teaching the humanities is all about is kind of showing people where the world they live in, like where did it come from. Why are things the way they are in 2026, and sort of trace the history of all these things, and you kind of get back to the original source material, and you can say, okay, that original source material, like that is now what the canon is. It is the foundation for the world that we've built on top of these stories, if we stay in the realm of literature.
Yes, yes. That's so important. And there's one specific instance I want to bring up. And did you see this news about the Texas Board of Education uh, updating their reading list to explicitly include biblical passages?
Yes, and then I posted about it and got raked for a few
Oh, you
days
did.
on X. Yeah.
So I want to rope this in because this is a very interesting topic to me because I said I grew up devout evangelical Christian, but I apostatized when I was 24. But that doesn't mean I'm anti-Christian necessarily because I see the cultural relevance of it, especially in the West. So
Yeah.
in a multicultural society that America is striving to be, I don't see how we get around this. The Bible needs to be taught, in my opinion, or not necessarily the whole Bible, but it is so
Yeah.
culturally relevant. And in
Yeah.
my opinion, it should, yes, it should be prioritized over other religious texts because it is a canonical work for the West. And to see people thinking that teaching it means you're proselytizing it
Yeah.
flabbergasted me. I thought that was I don't understand how people are making that mistake unless if they're high school kids. So that was very discouraging.
Yeah, I mean, I can easily see where you're gonna have, a teacher or two, you know, take it into, let's convert students while we're teaching biblical stories. I'm not as concerned about that. I'm definitely kind of in the space that says yes, we need to know these stories. Because these stories and these ideas pop up in so much other literature, which is really the kind of point of all this, or even I mean even understanding like basic concepts when it comes to the ways in which the laws have been structured in this country for 200. I guess I mean we have our independence for 250 years. The Constitution's only been around for 200. Gosh, I'm gonna get my math wrong. Some 230 some years. um, so the Constitution is a little bit younger than the
Yeah, I
Declaration.
forgot how many
Um,
years there was the
yeah.
lapse. I forgot.
So yeah, like you have to know Bible stories. It's one of those things that seems so obvious to me. I can't believe that there's a debate on it. And two of the things that I pointed to while I was kind of going back and forth with some people, where I just said like this is such a basic, obvious thing. Like students should know it. It might have been prompted about a month ago. I believe it was Princeton. A Princeton professor had posted an op-ed for like the Washington Post or Washington Times or some newspaper, talking about how he was teaching a class and his students like didn't understand basic Bible stories, and he's like, this is a problem because these things are obviously kind of like they're pervasive throughout literature, humanities, etc. The law, and two of the people that I point to with regard to arguments for, let's say, biblical literacy, just because they're atheist, is Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens. Now I don't know what they think, what they would think specifically about this Texas situation, but they both have, wrote. Christopher Hitchens obviously passed now, but they both wrote, extensively about why reading and understanding the Bible is important. Richard Dawkins in his book, The God Delusion, has an entire section of one of his chapters where he just kind of outlines all the ways in which the Bible is pervasive in culture. So so he has like different verses or different metaphors, allegories, whatever, and all the ways that they'll sort of pop up in modern Western civilization. So Richard Dawkins is like, you should read your Bible, and then there is, I believe it's the Atlantic magazine that Christopher Hitchens wrote this article in called "When." Oh gosh, I think it's called "When the King Saved God," something like that. But it's a read the King James version of the Bible. Like it's a like you should read the King James version of the Bible. And Christopher Hitchens is basically like the King James version of the Bible. Like it's as this literature sort of this moment in English literature. The printing of that Bible is a moment in English literature. That then became like extremely important for everything that kind of came after it. So both of these individuals have made strong cases for reading the Bible. Even from their atheist perspective, even sometimes they get a little I don't know what the word might be, sarcastic about it and say like they'll say things like read the Bible because then you'll understand how ridiculous it is with regard to their atheistic viewpoint. But they do make these like very pro, like be biblically literate with regard to the stories because of the culture that you live in. So yeah, I mean, it seems so obvious to even have to say, there are basic stories of the Bible that people should understand. But there are a lot of people who are strongly against it.
Yes, I remember, was it probably 2 years ago when Richard Dawkins came out and said he was culturally Christian, and that was a news
Yeah,
topic for a while. And that was something that really resonated with me because just because you might not believe the metaphysics of a faith doesn't mean that it hasn't drastically influenced your day-to-day life and your cognition. Quite honestly, that
yeah,
we grew up in a values system that in an
yeah,
ethos that is heavily influenced by these texts, Bible included, and
yeah.
all those other canonical texts that we keep mentioning included. So we've been talking a lot about the Western canon and how these literary texts inform our way of being. And you have your PhD in rhetoric, is that correct?
Correct.
So can you explain a little bit about what rhetoric is specifically and how does that
Yeah.
relate to the importance of storytelling when it comes to culture and the importance of myth?
So I'm a rhetorician, and very few people know what that means. They think I just give speeches for a living because that's the way we use it when it comes to political speeches. Rhetoric is the study of messages and their persuasiveness. And the messages, we consume messages all around us all the time. And so we can think of it as, you watch TV. An easy way to think of this is if you see little boys watching superhero movies and then they act out, Batman and Spider-Man. So they're mimicking the behavior of the messages. So that message is persuasive because it is changing their actions. Teenagers will listen to the newest music and then all of a sudden teenage slang starts to change. So their vocabulary is changing and then older people are like, I don't know what you're saying because the slang from your generation is different than the slang of my generation. So that's what rhetoric is looking at, is we are consuming messages through music, through movies, through books, If you read a lot of books, there's plenty of studies out there. If you want to increase your own vocabulary or your ability to communicate and speak, you should read a lot of books because you should read a lot of, let me rephrase that, you should read a lot of good books, books that are seen as classical, expanding your vocabulary books. Because you are going to mimic the ways in which those books are telling the story. You're going to start mimicking the ways in which those characters in those books carry themselves, use language, etc. But there's also ways in which there's this field known as visual rhetoric. So the world around us is influencing us. So this is some of the stuff, if we go back a while in our conversation and mention my mention of Roger Scruton and his documentary called Why Beauty Matters. He also has a book called Beauty, A Very Short Introduction. But he gets interested in the ways in which we surround ourselves with beauty because, and he talks about this in the film, it does just kind of affect us. So if you live in a place with really ugly architecture or like public art, his conclusion is that it's gonna affect the community. It's not gonna make the community feel really good. And you might walk around like, why don't I feel really good, kind of in this city? And it might be because the city is like has garbage architecture and ugly public art, as opposed to one of the examples he talks a lot about is like going to Bath in England. You go to like a beautiful European city, it's like there's something about it, like you just feel uplifted, and most people can't articulate why, and they don't necessarily understand why. But yeah, the architecture or the beautiful art around us, it's causing us to do certain things or feel certain ways in which we may not even understand that it's doing that. So that's what rhetoric
I have to
is.
interrupt a little bit on
Yeah.
that because what you're talking about, ugly city, that is something I have learned personally from small town Florida, now living in Portugal. Because in
Oh,
Portugal, they famously have these really nice sidewalks where they're
okay.
comprised of they're like mosaic stones and there's these nice designs. So I'm out running and looking down and I'm used to American concrete sidewalks.
Hmm.
And here and there, even the sidewalks are nice. And I look up and there's architecture.
Hmm.
And as a small town American, that was all foreign to me. And now that I've acclimated to that, I come home and I feel that spiritual depression of, oh man, this is ugly and it's not nice and I don't like being here.
Hmm. Um, yeah, so I mean that's what rhetoric is, the short version of it, and throughout many of my classes, we'll do a lot of sort of like rhetorical analysis. Students will pick certain pieces of artwork or architecture or political speeches, and then talk about the ways in which they've been influential. It doesn't have to be persuasive in sort of a manipulation or a political sense of the term. I'm trying to persuade you to vote for me, whatever, or a policy. But it does offer, you know, a lot of humility to individuals, because you realize, I am being influenced by a lot of things. In the advertising world, you might call this propaganda. I see a commercial for McDonald's and now I want to buy a Big Mac. That you could do rhetorical analysis sort of in that regard. When it comes to, these messages are influencing me somehow. Why do I suddenly feel the urge to speak a certain way, act a certain way, go purchase a certain product? And it's because there's messages that are kind of acting upon you at all times. And so we kind of get into the nitty gritty of that. But yeah, I mean, I approach it more from like a classical rhetorician perspective when I talk about, the books, the literature specifically, the stories that we've been telling over the, centuries and millennium. All of those have sort of worked their way through culture to kind of get us to the world that currently exists in 2026. And you're like, how was this world built? This world was built upon stories that persuaded this world to be this particular way. And I kind of want to take students back in time so we can find the sort of origin of the world that we currently live in.
Nice. Yes, I had never thought of rhetoric in that way of the persuasion through not just through verbal orations, but through any amount of storytelling or advertisement or even the surrounding culture, for lack of a better word, that's influencing your behavior to some
Yeah.
extent. So one part of rhetoric I want to dig into that closely related to the books is the importance of myth, because in common speak, we often conflate myth just to mean a fictitious story or a fake story, but it's much more than that. Can you explain that?
Uh, so myths can be fiction, um, but the ways in which they operate or uh, influence a culture, like they influence the culture in a very real way. So there's a way in which we have to sort of separate whether or not the myth itself is fictional and whether or not the myth itself is having real world consequences. And so, yes, when I talk about myths with my students, whether or not the original story is true, or maybe it's partially true, or maybe it's exaggerated, or what have you. If it is influencing us to act and behave and speak in certain ways, then it might as well be real in that regard, because it is having this sort of bigger effect on all of us, and we are acting as if that myth, that story is a real thing. So yeah, you can see this in people's like religious behaviors, for instance. Obviously, whether or not a certain religious tradition is true or not, people are definitely acting and sort of uh, uh, creating their lives around as if these stories from whatever religion they happen to be, as if those stories and those commandments from the religion are true. So people completely create a life based on those myths. And the same is true with regard to the patriotism in the United States, right? We just we're kind of in the 250th year of our independence, 1776. So we have these we have an origin story as a country. We have these sort of founding fathers and the myths around who they were, and some of the exaggerated or maybe historical fiction stories about some of the things that they did. But we kind of press into those things, and we live our lives today as Americans and patriots in 2026, as if those things in our founding documents are true. So we often talk about sort of holding ourselves to the standards of 1776, or we'll say things like living up to the ideals of 1776. What would George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, what would they feel about the ways in which we have become in 2026? So we kind of keep reaching back to 1776, our sort of founding mythological creation story, to sort of speak about and defend our to make a defense of our current actions and values. So you see politicians do this all the time when they're trying to pass a law, like I'm going to pass this law because it is the founding fathers would have been on my side. They use that type of language. So that's the importance of myth. Whether or not all myths are true is irrelevant to the fact that myths are causing us to act and speak and behave in certain ways.
Nice. I had never thought of myth merging or diverging, however you want to think of it, with true stories, that some true event happened and is documented, and then there's embellishments or exaggerations or alterations, and then that's the myth. I had always conceptualized myth more of a more or less fictitious story, something that's fantastical, that is thematically true to human nature, that it teaches us something about what it means to be human, that these were hard learned lessons that got incorporated into stories. I think one of the most interesting things about you is, yes, you love Tolstoy and literature and rhetoric, but also in your free time, you're throwing guys around on mats, wrestling, helping coach young men or coaching boys into being young men. Can you tell me a little bit about what got you interested in having the split? This dovetails, or sorry, bookends nicely with the opening conversation, that you're this amalgamation of elements.
So I started wrestling when I was 12, I believe, 12 years old. I've been wrestling, yeah, so mostly my entire life. Wrestling is always, I've had a little bit of success in the sport, and I've been around it a long time. I've been coaching for a while now. It's always been a place where I can go and feel comfortable. It's a place where I can go and feel like I know what I'm doing. So, after work, people have plenty of hobbies where they go and they relax and they don't feel like they, are being judged by their boss, or they don't feel like they're kind of falling behind at work. Wrestling has always been a place where I can go and I just kind of feel comfortable in my own skin. I feel like I know what I'm doing. When work gets overwhelming sometimes, and I feel like I don't know what I'm doing in the classroom or what I'm teaching or what I'm reading. Yeah, I can go and I can get on the mat and wrestle. So yeah, it's always been yeah, it's always had a prominent place in my life outside of academia. Yeah.
And do you ever weave in your love of literature with these boys? Are you coaching them beyond just the physicality of wrestling, similar to the Katrina situation where you imparted wisdom and life skills? So how does is there a corollary to that in the
So
athletic environment?
yeah, sometimes when I go in and coach, I'm not, I don't sit in front of my athletes and sort of tell them what I do. There's plenty of athletes I've had over the years who I've, coached for 3 or 4 years, and they found out I was a college professor, 4 or 5 years later. So there's plenty of them who have no idea what my day job is, and I'm fine with that. So they just know me as coach, and then maybe later they find out that I teach at a university, and then they'll start asking some questions. With some of them that I've had like closer relationships with, or have kind of seen them off to university or something. Yeah, like when they go to university, maybe as a graduation present, I'll give them 3 or 4 books that I think are important. The Old Man and the Sea is popular. Meditations of Marcus Aurelius is usually in there somewhere. So I will, give them some of those books. I've had plenty of wrestlers over the years who have called me on different occasions, who have asked me for some insights for some of the book reports they might have to do. I remember, gosh, probably 7, 8 years ago now, I had a student, I had an athlete. I was actually on vacation in Puerto Rico, and this wrestler of mine called me because he had a book report and he needed some information on something, and like couldn't understand the text. So he's like, "Hey, coach, can I call you real quick?" And him and I end up having like this 30-minute conversation on some book that he was reading. I can't remember what the book was, but it was some like normal kind of high school canonical book that a kid would read. Yeah, so they've sort of reached out to me in those ways. But I do think it's good. Um, I think that it's good for, if we kind of get into speaking specifically about young men. I think it's good for young men to see older men who are athletic to some extent. I'm definitely older and not insanely athletic anymore. But at least I've had a history around athletics, who can talk about athletics, but they can also have conversations on like, the humanities, right? Literature and rhetoric and all this other kind of stuff. I think that's good for young men to kind of see that avenue. Like they don't have to kind of completely press into just sort of that athletic side of themselves, that they can allow themselves to, say, read Jane Austen or Charles Dickens, or fall in love with Natasha while reading War and Peace, like everyone will do once they read that book. I think it's perfect. I think that's good, for some of my athletes to kind of see that side of me, or just kind of see that side of men in general, being able to speak intelligently about literature, about art. Right, you can probably see behind me. These aren't, originals. These are just some prints I have from, different places I've visited. But yeah, just to kind of have interesting conversations about artists, about sculptures, about architecture, about yeah, these sort of more emotional, beautiful things in our lives that we gravitate to, that we enjoy. That it's okay to kind of sit down at the end of the day and, read Anna Karenina, which I've done on multiple occasions. Yeah, I think that's good for young, testosterone filled high school wrestlers to just kind of be exposed to different ways in which they can kind of go about their life.
Yeah, this ropes back into my opening idea that I had about the tragedy of the stereotype. That for whatever reason, we tend to default you're either a bookworm or you're a jock. Or in my case, I was a band geek in high school, these
Mm.
things. And it can really flatten an individual, and that you should, or it's only cool to focus on it. So I look up to you and say thank you for being a man that embodies these two seemingly incongruent facets, because I think both are incredibly important to young men in particular. Yeah, especially the young boys, testosterone fueled. They need to get the wiggles out. I was just like that. Like, you need those athletics. You need something to vent that energy, but to also make men of culture, so they're not just foolhardy. That's like, hey, it's okay to read emotionally devastating books and let it move you, because you're going to need that wisdom later in life. And I have to plug this in because it was something I found so interesting. Have you ever watched the TV show Stranger Things?
Um, I've seen a few episodes. I'm not extremely familiar with it, but I think yeah, I understand the basic plot.
Okay, so I wrote the essay about Steve the babysitter because to me, he was one of the perfect archetypal breaks. He was this perfect idea where they primed him to be a certain way. And then he ultimately became this character that was this juxtaposition of seemingly incongruent parts that I found deeply masculinely instructive, because they initially start him, and they had initially written the part to be this. They changed it once Joe Keery was cast to be the quintessential, or the archetypal high school jerk that's a jock that gets the girls. He's suave, but Joe Keery had this sensitivity about him. He had this suaveness about him, and they liked him. He was really charismatic, and they're like, he's too good of an actor just to make him this one dimensional. So they wrote him to, in the first season of the show, to admit he was wrong, and to actively seek forgiveness and reconciliation, and to ditch the friends that were dragging him down. So they gave him this background character, this entire arc in the first season, and then they perpetuated it into season 2, where he partners up with one of the younger kids. So he's literally walking around trying to hunt a monster with a kid that's about 4 years younger than him. And that becomes this hilarious joke that he becomes Steve the babysitter, this cool high school kid, all of a sudden is looking after all of the junior hires and protecting them. And this is an arc that goes throughout the entire series, even that it becomes a running joke. But they give him this lovely evolution of, yes, you can be suave, you can take care of yourself, you can style your hair, it might be a little effeminate, people might joke about it, but you can also have courage, and you can also look out for your village. You can bring people under your wing. So when you're talking about the power of stories and how they influence behavior, Stranger Things being this very pop culturally relevant story, and in the middle of it, the character that was originally supposed to be an archetype became one of my favorite characters, because he really showed this notion of masculinity and how to step up. And I called it Steve the babysitter. It takes a village, because that's the village stepping up and helping mentor these young boys. So when I see men like you also coaching them, and then also having a 30-minute phone call while you're on vacation to help with a college report, I'm like, yes, that's the model we need moving forward.
I think there has to come a point with, if I get on a I'll get on a platform for a second. I definitely can be humbled later, but there does have to come a point with we'll say men in general, where it's like, what is your bravado for? What is all this alpha male social media space? Like, what are we doing this for? And I think too much of it is, people want to be alpha male because it's like, I'm gonna get mine, I'm gonna get my money, I'm gonna get the girl, and it's just very self-centered, self-centered. Excuse me. So it's very self-centered. But if the entire culture around you is crumbling, it's like, what have you left behind except a large bank account, and some fancy cars? And if you're going to have some sort of influence, you have to think, like, what are you protecting? What sort of cultural things do you want to do you want to make sure live beyond you? And so, yeah, there is some sort of, cultural inheritance. I'll go back to Roger Scruton. He talks about, people in this day and age, you need to think of yourselves as stewards of culture, as opposed to just consumers. We're here to kind of take culture that was given to us, and now we're supposed to pass it on to the next generation. And yeah, like what is it that we're protecting? And it can't just be this sort of self-centered, I just kind of want to, live my life while everything else around me is crumbling and falling apart. I want, Hemingway and Steinbeck and Shakespeare and Tolstoy and Dickens and Austen and on and on and on. I want all of those books to be passed on to the next generation. And the same is true with classical music, which we didn't, get into. But it's like I would like the next generation to be familiar with Beethoven and Mozart, and the next generation to be familiar with, Rembrandt and Michelangelo and Da Vinci, and so it's what is it that we're protecting? If we're just going to do all this like big macho testosterone, fitness influencer, alpha male stuff online, but it's empty of the protection of the culture that we want to pass on, or at least like we have to be the ones who are mentoring the next generation, and sort of cultivating those types of cultural habits in them. To read and to listen to good music and to consume artwork and to sort of surround their life with beauty. It's kind of all for nothing. And so, yeah, have a ton of testosterone. I like doing very masculine things in that regard. I don't apologize for my aggressive streak in life, or the weightlifting or the wrestling. But it all it has to come back to this question of what do I hope to leave when I'm done with either teaching or I'm completely gone in this life? What do I hope remains behind me? And it is, I hope that, the culture that I got to grow up with, the books that I got to read, the life that I got to live, I hope that, it's been great so far. And I would like other people to experience those cultural things. And so those are the things I want to teach. Those are the things I want to support. Those are the books I want to read and then talk about, because I want other people to kind of get the same enjoyment, the life enrichment out of those things that I got.
Dr. Joshua Phillips, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.